Hi guys, today I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I'm about to mount the transmission pan on my Jeep Wrangler, and I'm going to show you a method that I use, which is basically a stepwise method that assures you that you won't have any leaks once you have mounted it. So, and the first part of this is actually just to sealing the gasket. This is a LubeLocker gasket and how you seal it towards the transmission pan itself. And once you've done this job, then you can just go on the car, and then you don't need to worry about the seal between the transmission pan and the gasket, and you only need to seal it towards the transmission in itself. I'm also going to mention a couple of words about different types of gasket makers. Here is a typical ultra black. This is fermentx. Fermentx comes in different ones. It comes as a Supra or ultra gray or the ultra blue one. These are different gaskets and gasket makers, and they provide you with different stiffness in the actually gasket seal that you are able to make with these ones. I'm using a couple of regular pins. These ones are used to line the gasket into the transmission pan, and I will show you how I do that. And for that I use a water-soluble glue. And well, let's turn the camera around and I'll show you. The first thing you want to do is to get yourself one of these glass plates. This is hardened glass, and it's actually here it says it's a safety glass. If you don't know where to find one of these, you can look in your fridge. This is the bottom support shelf, and this is perfectly flat. The reason why you pick this one is that it's perfectly flat, and you need to clean it properly before you do this. And that you can do with any detergent and water. And now when we have the glass surface lying here, and this glass surface can now be regarded as our transmission on the car, then we just place out the gasket so that you can line up your transmission pan on top of it. And if the holes everywhere here are exactly lined in the middle, then you can then glue on the gasket onto your transmission pan. So now the holes are sitting on top of each other. Then we just could take a regular plier like this one, and we cut off the bottom part of the pin. These ones, I'm going to glue them in to each one of these holes here. The reason why I do this is because the next stage would be that we would place a thin layer of gasket maker underneath, in between the gasket and the pan, and that thin layer will basically hold the gasket in place on the transmission pan, and the pins make it easier to line the pan onto the gasket, because you don't want any of the holes to be off in on any of the sides of the transmission pan. And once you have placed this on top of each other, then you don't have much time to reposition everything. So you want it to come down right on top to get the best possible seal between the gasket and the transmission pan. This way we will eliminate all the guessing whether there is a perfect seal between the transmission pan and the gasket. And the only way that it can leak later on when you mount it is if you don't have a perfect seal between the transmission itself and the gasket on the other side. The size of the pins are just about 1 millimeter smaller in diameter than the holes themselves. And I tried this before, and it works actually good. So the next thing we will do is that we will remove the pan, and we put that aside, and then we're going to make sure that the gasket stays in place. And then we're going to use the water-soluble glue to glue the gasket onto the glass plate, so that we are sure that it doesn't move anything when we continue working in this line. So basically we turn around the gasket and we spread a little bit of glue over the gasket side. You don't need to use too much here. You just want to make sure that it sticks to the glass surface. This glue is not a problem because this glue, as I said before, is water soluble, and we will dissolve it later on and remove it completely before we mount the gasket on place of the transmission pan under the car. So now we just need to smear it out a bit. That's about it. Then we just turn the gasket around, and there we are. It takes about 2 hours for this glue to harden. So in the meanwhile now I will place the pins right in the middle of the pinholes or the bolt holes. One thing that is important is that you don't want any of the glue, the water-soluble glue, on top of the gasket at this stage, because this top of the gasket is now going to be sealed against the transmission pan, and it needs to be perfectly clean. By putting the transmission pan back in place on the gasket while you have the water-soluble glue underneath, and you put a bit of pressure on it, you will make sure that the water-soluble glue is evenly distributed underneath the gasket. And what comes out here, you can easily just wipe it off. So now all the pins are in place and the gasket is also glued onto the glass surface. Now we can take the transmission pan and we just put it back in place by aligning it with help from the pins. And that's it. Adjust it in the middle. You now know that you have an even pressure on the entire gasket. So while the glue is hardening, you just need to put a couple of books on it and then wait for the 2 to 3 hours that it takes for it to completely dry. Now most of it is dry, and I'll show you what it looks like underneath. Here you see the gasket is sitting on the glass plate, and if I turn it around, then you see that the water-soluble glue is only a very thin little layer, and in most of the areas it's actually the sealant on the gasket is coming straight through. But if you pour some water on this now later on, this will all dissolve. But at this stage it keeps the gasket in place when we're going to glue the transmission pan onto this gasket with a permanent seal. Now among these different gasket makers, we have the Ultra Blue here, and the Ultra Black, and this is the Ultra Grey, but it says Supra Grey in Europe. The difference between these gasket makers is that this one is very low viscous. It's made for very tight fittings, and I wouldn't use this unless I knew that I had two very smooth aluminum surfaces mounted together. This one is somewhere in between the Ultra Grey, and this one could probably work, but it's like when you go for something which might have a gap of 0.3 millimeters, this one is still also a little bit too low viscous. And from the mechanics I've talked to, the one to use for applications like this is the Ultra Black. This is also the stiffest one. It's almost like a paste that you can smear out, but it's considerably less fluid than the other two, and it also doesn't require any extra torquing after you assemble your parts. So this one is what we're going to use today. But before that, I'm going to apply some release agents around the borders here, so that we don't need to risk that the gasket maker is attaching to the glass surface. We only want the gasket maker to attach in between on this surface towards the metal surface. So I'm taking these release agents. This is a polyvinyl alcohol. It is something that you can buy in any kind of hobby stores. And now I'm going to apply this around the gasket, and I want to make sure that it gets all the way in under, but I must carefully make sure that nothing comes on top of the gasket, because with this release agent the gasket maker will release immediately, while if you don't have it, it will stick hard. You only need a very, very thin layer of this. And then I'll do the outside as well. So here you can see how the release agent has been applied. It's kind of bluish, greenish in its color, and it's evenly applied all the way in around the corners, and nothing has been put on top of the gasket. So now the gasket is completely clean, and I've also taken some isopropanol to clean off the edges of the pan, so that's completely clean. And now I'm going to apply a thin layer of this fermentx ultra black over the gasket, and you have about 15 minutes to work with this material before it becomes surface dry. So you don't want to take too much time to do this, and it's not going to be required a very thick layer. So you just start in the middle here, and then we're going to take a plastic little tool and smear it out and even it. As I mentioned before, this is quite viscous, this ultra black, and it's called ultra black because it's black, but it also contains carbon black particles inside it. It's the same type of particles you have in tires for cars, which makes the rubber or the final rubbery material stiffer than the other two versions, the blue and the gray. So then I use a little thing like this plastic piece. I don't know where it came from, but and then we just roll it out. You don't need to worry about having too much of this fermentx on here, because everything that's in excess will be squeezed out and will be cut off later on when it's hardened. Alright, so now you can see how I have smeared out the silicone, the fermentx gasket maker all over the gasket, and the thickness about 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter in average, and you cannot any longer see the red lines underneath that are supposed to seal against the oil. So the next step here is to place the pan on top of this, and now as you can see the pins come in handy. There we go. And all the pins are now exactly in the positions where they should be. Still, I haven't put any pressure on the transition pan. I will do that in a minute, but you want to make sure that all the holes are aligned at this stage. And right now you actually have quite a lot of bubbles in the fermentx that you have just smeared out, but these bubbles will be eliminated once you put pressure on the pan. Here you can see what everything looks like from the underneath after 12 hours. Now we have the water-soluble glue here everywhere. And the next step is now to dissolve this water-soluble glue, and we will do that in hot water while the fermentx that is sealing the pan towards the gasket remains intact, because that's not water-soluble. At the same time we will do a leak test on the first seal between the gasket and the transmission pan, and we will do that in the hot water. So here you see now how the transmission pan has been immersed down in water, and it's actually floating here. And over on this part over here, the water-soluble glue started to dissolve. Over here you can see it was used to be blue with the release agent. It's all gone, because that's also water-soluble. This takes about 15 to 20 minutes, and then the glass plate will release from the top of the gasket, while the silicone sealant underneath is still intact. Now, I also missed to say that in the beginning you could actually see that the entire pan was floating on the surface, and that means that the gasket sealed towards the pan was completely tight. It didn't leak in any water. If there would have been any leaks there, water would have been easier to pass through than potentially in the future transmission oil would have to pass out, because water is less viscous than transmission oil. Now when you see this, some of you may wonder, well, if you could seal it, the entire pan against the glass plate, why didn't you just seal it this way with this glue underneath the car? Well, and that's because, well, the water-soluble glue will eventually also dissolve under your car. And here the water-soluble glue was just used as an aid to position the gasket on the glass plate, so that I later on could insert the pins and then have it stuck to the glass plate. And while I applied the RTV or the fermentx, I had the possibility to move the entire pan a little bit back and forth without having the gasket moving on the glass plate. And that way I could eliminate some of the potential bubbles that would be present in the fermentx between the gasket and the transmission pan. Now it's been 20 minutes about, and the glass released. So now we're back out here on the table, and now we have an absolutely perfectly sealed gasket towards the pan. And there's a couple of benefits doing it this way. You can make sure that you have no excess silicone on the inside of the gasket that may fall off with time and end up in your transmission channels. It's also, you also leak proof tested it, so it's completely leak proof. And in addition to that, you know that the exterior surface, this surface over here, is completely flat. There's no question about it. So when you come this far, then it's actually just to take this entire pan and mount it up to your transmission. And provided that side is completely flat, you will have a leak-proof transmission in the future. And here you can see how the 14 holes all are perfectly aligned thanks to the use of the pins